Thanks, Stuart Home, for joining us this hour. It is good to have you here on a Friday night. Super interesting news day today. There are surprising developments afoot among the 2020 Democratic presidential contenders, including one that is, at least on its face, quite constructive, actually. Probably quite good news for the Democrats as a group. We're going to have that story ahead tonight. Also, as the NRA met for its annual convention today, and the President of the United States gave a fairly blood-curdling speech to that organization, including calling for the scalps of his political enemies. We've got a snapshot from the courtroom today from where Russian agent Maria Butina was sentenced for operating within the NRA and within Republican Party circles on behalf of the Russian government. This case took a turn at the end into really interesting counterintelligence territory, which I think speaks to what we just learned about the Trump administration in the Mueller report. So as the NRA convenes, the NRA infiltrating Russian agent was sentenced today. We will have that report ahead as well, along with some expert help to sort that out. What prosecutors were trying to tell us in the resolution of that case today, that's coming up. We are, of course, 1 week out now since the redacted report was released from Robert Mueller's investigation. The president, of course, had initially said that Mueller's report was the best news for him ever. Now, every day, he is denouncing the report and everything in it, to the point where he is now publicly accusing his own White House counsel, Don McGahn, of having lied to the special counsel's office. McGahn told the special counsel and the FBI that President Trump had directed him to fire special counsel Robert Mueller, and then told McGahn to create a false document to cover that up. I mean, you can see why the president wouldn't want to own up to that kind of behavior once you see it in black and white there in Mueller's report. But the way the president is pursuing this now is maybe causing some new trouble of its own for him, because Don McGahn, of course, has been subpoenaed by Congress to testify about those same things that he described to the special counsel. President Trump and the White House have said they will try to stop Don McGahn from testifying to Congress. But what do you think about how this is going to end here? I mean, do you think the White House can really count on Don McGahn putting himself in potentially dire legal jeopardy by defying a subpoena because the White House says he should, because Trump says he should? I mean, do you think that Don McGahn can be counted on to be in that kind of a generous, even self-sacrificing mood here? Because at the same time, the White House is telling Don McGahn that he needs to defy that subpoena and potentially put himself in legal jeopardy by doing so, there is this awkward and counter-strategic thing that the president is now doing, which is that he is now publicly accusing Don McGahn of being a liar. He's accusing McGahn of lying to federal investigators, which is a federal crime. Now, Don McGahn, however much he loves President Trump and liked his White House service and all the rest of it, he might reasonably want to defend himself from that kind of allegation. But the White House is demanding that Don McGahn shouldn't be able to defend himself from that charge. He should not be allowed to testify about what he knows and what he saw. He should not be allowed to back up and explain the evidence that he provided to the special counsel. It has been 8 days since we learned from the redacted special counsel's report how much President Trump really has to worry about in terms of Don McGahn. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post have reported this week that the president is convinced, and the president has been telling people, that McGahn testifying in Congress would be a huge threat to him in terms of the prospects of him being impeached. That is apparently front of mind for the president. Well, if the president is worried about Don McGahn posing that kind of a threat to him, this new he's a liar strategy is probably not helping in terms of the magnitude or the present nature of that threat. The Washington Post, for example, is now reporting directly, quote, some Trump advisors are saying privately that they fear Trump's ire toward McGahn could eventually prompt McGahn to speak to protect his reputation. Yeah, duh. Other legal observers, including at least one former presidential lawyer, are now warning that the president's attacks on McGahn and the president's campaign firing McGahn's law firm after the Mueller report came out, that could all be construed as criminal witness retaliation by the president. The president retaliating against McGahn for the witness testimony that McGahn gave in this federal investigation. That's a crime for which the penalty is 10 years in prison, and for which the 5-year statute of limitations starts anew every time the president takes an action that could be considered criminal under the witness retaliation statute. So, I mean, this is getting dicier and dicier by the day. While the president is cultivating and aggravating his very own 21st century John Dean problem, and the White House is trying to figure out how they can block that probably inevitable testimony from Don McGahn. Meanwhile, the Democrats in Congress are, over the course of this week, they have been assessing their options for how to deal with the White House and the administration now that the president has decreed that all subpoenas will be defied, that no information will be handed over to congressional investigations, that they will not allow the handing over of any documents. They will not allow any testimony, even with legally actionable subpoenas. Well, how are they going to enforce that? What are their options? Bloomberg was first to report this week that at the Judiciary Committee, the chairman there, Jerry Nadler, is considering fines, considering financial penalties for any person who does not comply with a subpoena from Congress. Nadler has also reportedly suggested that federal officials who refuse to obey subpoenas could even be jailed. And I know that sounds jarring, but that prospect has now been echoed by Congressman Jerry Connolly, who is on the Oversight Committee. He tells CNN, quote, "We will go to the max to enforce the constitutional role of the legislative branch of government, including explicitly saying that may involve incarcerating some people who defy subpoenas." The same sentiment was echoed by Congresswoman Robin Kelly, who is also on the Oversight Committee. She now tells MSNBC, quote, "We'll be talking about fines. We'll be talking about actually putting people in jail that are not cooperating if we have to go to that extreme." I don't think anyone really wants to do that, but the Congresswoman says, quote, "If they don't cooperate, then I'm for putting people in jail." Again, she's on the Oversight Committee. Same sentiment was echoed by Congressman David Cicilline from the Judiciary Committee. He is now citing a precedent from the 1930s in which an assistant secretary of commerce really was jailed for contempt of Congress, jailed for defying a subpoena to show up and testify and to produce documents. I should say, in that case from the 1930s, when that assistant commerce secretary was jailed, they jailed him, at least for a while, at the Willard Hotel in D.C. because they didn't feel that they had a suitable jail. The Willard Hotel was then and is now quite nice. So that might have softened the whole constitutional confrontation part of that standoff. I mean, jailing government officials and regular American citizens who defy legally actionable subpoenas from congressional committees, that is literally what was threatened by Watergate Committee Chairman Sam Ervin in 1973 when the Nixon White House tried to stop federal employees from testifying to that committee, including specifically Nixon White House counsel John Dean. After Nixon and the Nixon White House tried to block Nixon aides, including John Dean, from testifying to that committee, Sam Ervin literally called a press conference and said he would issue arrest warrants for any White House officials who didn't turn up to testify. And of course, we know they did ultimately turn up to testify. But, I mean, even looking at the whole historical record on that and the number of times it's ever been hinted at or threatened, I mean, we're there. We have already jumped right to the point where subpoenas are being defied and jail is being threatened. I mean, right away, we are up to that point again within 8 days of the redacted Mueller report being made public. And it's still only the redacted version. And don't worry, you are not the only one who may be feeling a little shaky about where the country is headed next here, given how fast we seem to be careening down this cul-de-sac. Ultimately, the issues of accountability for what we have just been through are very much still in process. It doesn't even necessarily feel like they're a process. It at least feels like they're still in motion. It at least feels like we're still in that tumble dry cycle. Recall, for example, just one of the incidents of alleged criminal obstruction of justice by the president that was detailed in Volume 2 of the Mueller report. This is one we've talked about before on the show since the report came out. This is the one where the president tried to draft his former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, to help him shut down the special counsel's investigation. This was June 2017. The Washington Post had just reported that Mueller's investigation wouldn't only encompass stuff from the campaign and what Russia did and whether anybody in the Trump campaign helped in what Russia did during the campaign. The Post reported in June that the investigation would also include actions that Trump took as president, and specifically the question of whether he had obstructed justice by trying to obstruct that investigation as president. Now, what the Mueller report explains is that after that report came out in the Washington Post, the president freaked. And he told his White House counsel, Don McGahn, that he needed to call the Justice Department and get Mueller fired. And Don McGahn said no. The president then took a meeting with Corey Lewandowski, of all people. Corey Lewandowski, a private citizen at that point, no government or White House role whatsoever. The president sat Corey Lewandowski down in the Oval Office. He told him to take dictation. Corey, write this down. Told him to write down a message that was essentially a draft statement that he wanted Attorney General Jeff Sessions to deliver. That draft statement that he wanted Jeff Sessions to deliver would have Jeff Sessions announcing that he was unrecusing himself from the Russia investigation. He was taking over control of the special counsel, that he could no longer look at anything that happened in the 2016 election. Instead, Mueller henceforth must only look at future crimes. He must only look at crimes that Russia might commit against future American elections that hadn't happened yet. But all of 2016, that's no longer what Mueller's looking at. Now, as the Mueller report describes, Lewandowski got this direction from the president, wrote it all down, and then actually did take action to try to reach Jeff Sessions to deliver that message. They ultimately never got together, and Corey Lewandowski never delivered him that message. But Lewandowski then decided to hand that task off to a White House official, to Rick Dearborn, who was then Deputy White House Chief of Staff. According to Mueller's report, Dearborn said, okay, sure, I'll do it. I'll take care of it. I'll pass on that message to Jeff Sessions. I'll get Jeff Sessions to do this crazy thing. But then Rick Dearborn did not actually pass the message on, did not actually do it. Now, we've talked about this specific incident on the show since the Mueller report came out, because it's freaking ridiculous, right? Because it's comical. Corey, write this down. But also because Mueller lays this out very clearly, not just in terms of the facts in his report. He lays out very clearly, very plainly, like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, but one that only had one available ending, right? So make your choice carefully, but there's only one choice. I mean, Mueller laid out in as straightforward a way as possible that ridiculous incident with the president telling a private citizen to go get the attorney general to give this speech unrecusing himself, limiting Mueller's investigation to future crimes. He then told Corey Lewandowski that Corey Lewandowski should feel free to fire the attorney general if the attorney general wouldn't agree to do that, right? Mueller lays that out in terms of the facts as potential criminal obstruction of justice. And then he explains why that looks like criminal obstruction of justice. You need 3 elements under the law to bring obstruction charges and to try to prove them in court. You need obstructive act, in this case, the president directing the curtailing of Mueller's remit so it would no longer apply to anything having to do with Donald Trump. You need a nexus to an ongoing investigation. The Mueller investigation was the ongoing investigation. And you need evidence of corrupt intent on the part of the person carrying out the obstructive act. And on that, Mueller was very, very blunt in Volume 2 of his report, said there was substantial evidence of Trump's corrupt intent to enact this act of obstruction, which was related to an ongoing investigation, and the intent was to try to save himself by curtailing this investigation that posed a threat to him. So, obstructive act, check. Nexus to an ongoing investigation, check, check. Investigation, evidence of intent to obstruct, check, check, check. Right? It's all there. And Mueller just lays it all out in black and white. It's not even in legalese. It's easy to read. It's a comical situation, but he lays out how it's a crime. Upon receiving the report, Attorney General William Barr announced that didn't look like a crime to him. That didn't look like obstruction of justice to him. I wouldn't charge that. Now, of course, we got that assertion from Attorney General William Barr before Mueller's report, even in its redacted form, was ever released to anybody else other than him. He just said, I've got the report, you don't, I've looked at it all, and I've decided that none of these things are crimes. Like, we never got any explanation from William Barr as to how he arrived at that conclusion, let alone how he could have instantly arrived at that conclusion, not just on that alleged crime, but on all of the other alleged criminal behavior along those lines described in excruciating detail over hundreds of pages in this report. He was able to just somehow absorb the whole thing. Like he just held the whole thing to his chest. Like, breathe in. Nope. No crimes there. I'm the Attorney General. You know, I can just sniff. There's an odor that I can. Nope. It's fine. He's never explained how he processed all that so quickly and all uniformly, no crimes here. Now, what we're now realizing, 8 days in to Mueller's report being, at least in its redacted form, being public, we're now realizing that it's possible that William Barr is a little embarrassed about how he has handled this. Now that we have all seen what's in this report, which he took a deep whiff of and decided he smelled no crimes, we can tell now that he may be a little uneasy with the public having an understanding of the distance between his proclamation that there was no crime here and what we can see about Mueller laying out evidence of a crime and why it should be charged. The reason we can tell he's maybe a little embarrassed about that, maybe feeling a little heat about that, is because the Washington Post has now published a long piece based on anonymous Justice Department sources who are, quote, people familiar with the thinking that led to Barr's conclusions. Now, why would people familiar with the thinking that led to William Barr's conclusions be speaking to the Washington Post about the content of his conclusions? I mean, I don't know, and neither do you. That's the beauty of anonymous sources, even those who speak on the condition of anonymity because of the sensitivity of the matter. But the argument that is now being spelled out to the Washington Post to try and make Barr look good, to try and justify what Barr did here, his conclusion that he doesn't see any crime here, it's honestly not a great argument. I mean, what Barr is telling the Washington Post here, what people familiar with the thinking that led to Barr's conclusions are telling the Post here, is that particular instance of alleged criminal obstruction that I just described, the one involving Corey Lewandowski and the president telling Corey to take a memo and bring a draft speech to Jeff Sessions and tell Jeff Sessions he's going to have to unrecuse so he can kibosh Mueller's investigation of what happened in 2016. And if he doesn't do it, Corey Lewandowski is supposed to fire the attorney general. I mean, that particular instance of obstruction, according to Barr's thinking, as described in the Washington Post now by these anonymous sources, Barr's thinking is that shouldn't have been charged as obstruction of justice because it was a scheme to obstruct justice that did not work. It didn't actually succeed after the president tried to set that obstruction in motion. Quote, bringing a prosecution on these facts would have been complicated because the obstruction relies on multiple people in a chain all doing something. And since all those people in the chain didn't all do what they were directed to do, that meant the obstruction didn't work, and therefore it's not obstruction. That's the argument that's being spelled out to the Washington Post so we can all have a better understanding about how Barr arrived at his conclusion. Now, I am no lawyer, but let's do a thought experiment. Let's say you are sitting on your front step and a dude runs past you, pell-mell runs past you. A loud alarm starts sounding at the bank on your corner. All of the employees, all of the customers run out of the bank on your corner and say, that guy who just ran past you, he just robbed a bank. As you are absorbing this information, then a cop comes running down your street, coming from the direction of the bank, and he is going after the guy who just ran past you. Everybody's pointing at that guy saying, that's the bank robber, that's the bank robber. The cop is yelling, stop thief, stop, I'm police, stop. At this point, you, sitting on your front porch, stick your foot out and trip the cop. Under this purported reasoning from Attorney General William Barr, as spelled out in the Washington Post, that's fine. You're good. As long as ultimately that bank robber still got caught at some point, you're good. Your obstruction effort, yeah, you tried, but it didn't work, which means you're fine. Now, do not try this at home. This is not how the law actually works, but this is the way that William Barr, or rather people familiar with the thinking that led to the conclusions of William Barr, that's how they are explaining how he arrived at this idea that President Trump didn't commit the crime of obstruction of justice based on Robert Mueller plainly explaining exactly that the president committed the crime of obstruction of justice. So why is this in the Washington Post now? Why has this purported justification of William Barr's conclusions that the president didn't commit a crime here, why has that just appeared in the Post? And regardless of what you think about the quality of the reasoning that is being explained here and the quality of the lawyering that Barr is trying to have ascribed to him, why is his thinking process, why is his reasoning being described by anonymous sources to the Washington Post today? Is it possible that William Barr is feeling a little bit of heat now about how his decisions look, given what we can see, and even the redacted version of Mueller's report? And I mean, this Corey Lewandowski, Michigas, this is only one of the alleged incidents of obstruction of justice by the president that is spelled out in totally plain language in Mueller's report. There's a whole bunch of incriminating incidents that are described in as much detail, with as much damning evidentiary and legal support, and as much clarity from Mueller on how the president's acts meet every legal element of obstruction of justice. It's not just this Corey Lewandowski one. There's a whole bunch of them. Don't take it from me. This is actually a pretty good summary.
What do we do if the president commits a crime? Do we let him get away with it? The crime is not a difficult one to understand. Obstruction of justice, the statute making obstruction criminal, prohibits interfering or attempting to interfere with a criminal prosecution or an investigation that the government's conducting. So when Bob Mueller said the president of the United States did about a dozen things to slow down, impede, negate, or interfere with the investigation of his campaign or of his former national security advisor, General Michael Flynn, that's a serious allegation of criminal activity. So when the president asked his former advisor and my former colleague at Fox, K.T. McFarland, to write an untruthful letter to the file knowing the government would subpoena it, that's obstruction of justice. When the president asked Corey Lewandowski, his former campaign manager, to get Mueller fired, that's obstruction of justice. When the president asked his then White House counsel to get Mueller fired and then lie about it, that's obstruction of justice. When he asked Don McGahn to go back to the special counsel and change his testimony, that's obstruction of justice. When he dangled a pardon in front of Michael Cohen in order to keep Cohen from testifying against him, that's obstruction of justice.
Yeah, I told you there were more examples. It's a good list. That is Andrew Napolitano, who's a former state court judge in New Jersey. He is now the chief legal analyst on the Fox News channel. And his take on the implications of the Mueller report, both in terms of the president and in terms of how Attorney General William Barr handled this, it's not unlike what you may have been hearing in legal circles for the past week since Mueller's redacted report was released. But it's definitely unlike what this president and this administration have gotten used to hearing about themselves on Fox News.
Why not charge him? Because the Attorney General of the United States would have blocked such a charge. Because the Attorney General of the United States is of the view that obstruction of justice can only occur if you're interfering with a criminal investigation of yourself. But that's not what the obstruction statute says. And that's not what law enforcement believes, and that's not what prosecutors do. Prosecutors prosecute people who interfere with government functions. And that's what the president did by obstruction. Where's this going to end? We don't know. If he had ordered his aides to violate federal law, to save a human life, or to preserve human freedom, he would at least have a moral defense to his behavior. But ordering them to break federal law to save him from the consequences of his own behavior, that is immoral, that is criminal, that is defenseless, and that is condemnable.
And that is the Fox News channel, which might explain why Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein gave a super defensive speech last night in New York City, declaring that everything that went wrong here happened before he got there, and none of it can be blamed on him. It may explain why the president himself is trying this incredibly risky gambit of trying to block all testimony by people who served as witnesses for Mueller, including his own White House counsel. It may also be part of the heat that Attorney General William Barr appears to be feeling, at least as evidenced by the anonymous sources popping up in the news, bearing blind quotes about how totally reasonable all of William Barr's decisions have been here, despite all visible evidence to the contrary. William Barr will be testifying in open session in the Senate on Wednesday and in open session in the House on Thursday, which means over the weekend, I will bet you dollars to donuts that we will get more blind quotes from anonymous officials talking about really, if you think about it, how reasonable William Barr really has been in this whole process, despite what you might have heard. And actually, really, if you think about it, he's kind of the hero of the story, isn't he? Honestly, though, given Barr's performance when it comes to handling Mueller's findings thus far, in this week since we've been able to see him, why is Congress bothering to hear from him at all? Haven't we sort of heard from William Barr? Haven't we sort of got a sense from of where William Barr is coming from on all this and how he fits into this process? I mean, I'd be happy to just stick with anonymous officials describing William Barr's take on things. Why don't they just bring in Mueller instead? Why are they bringing in Barr next week? And what's the wait to getting Mueller to testify? Tick-tock. Lots to come tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.